Hi, this is Glenn with Zeppelin Design Labs, and today we're going to lead you through the construction and finishing of the cabinet for your Percolator amplifier. Notice the kit comes with these 4 pieces of poplar. Poplar sometimes shows a variety of color and grain, so the first thing you want to do is arrange the 4 pieces so that you like the way that the grain looks. Note that the shorter pieces are the sides and the longer pieces are the top and bottom, and they span between the sides. So just flip the 4 pieces around until you like the way they look, and then label the corners. I like to just use like AA, BB, CC. You can put whatever marks you want on here. But this lets you put the 4 pieces back together in the same arrangement very easily later on. And I put those labels near the front edge of the cabinet so you can distinguish between when the cabinet's facing up and facing down. So right now we're picturing that the cabinet is facing upwards, like you're looking at the front of the cabinet. All right, whip out a pair of scissors or a razor blade and cut out all of the templates that came with your kit. Cut them as neatly as you can. Great, now lay down the 4 pieces. See how I'm turning them so that the outside faces are all facing up. Now you've got a template that goes on the bottom. You've got a template that goes on the side. On the right-hand side, there it goes. Notice the edges are labeled top, bottom, front, back. And you've got a template for the cabinet top. And again, there's a label that says front edge, back edge, and so forth. Go ahead and tape that down with some masking tape and line up the front edge of each template with the front edge of the wood. Get that nice and tight, and then center it side to side, and then fold down the tape there. You can ignore what's going on along the back edge. Now we're taping down the bottom template. Now, once those are all taped, you take an awl or a nail and you poke a hole right through the center of every circle in the entire arrangement here. You do them all as neat as possible. Nice and accurate. Ta-da. Now, to do the left-hand side, you take off the right-hand side template and flip it over as shown. So it's face down. You need a new set of masking tape. The first set is facing the wrong way now. It's facing upwards. So here I'm using a new piece of tape, and I'm lining up the front edge and centering it end to end, just like we did when it was on the other side. And now we're going through the holes from the back to transfer the same hole pattern onto the cabinet left-hand side. Now, in this case, I'm leaving the templates in place. Sometimes I find that's awkward and I take them off. Sometimes I leave them on and I wish I had taken them off. If you choose to take them off, keep them close at hand because there's helpful information on those templates to remind you what you're supposed to be doing with those holes. So don't throw them away. Now, put the 4 parts back together, this time with the labels facing down. So this is the face of the cabinet is now down against your work surface. Cabinet face down. And put a bar clamp on here to snug the parts together, just to keep them from sliding around. Now pick one corner and line it up real accurate and smooth and tight. You can see that's the bottom facing you there. Once the joint is really accurate and clean, squeeze the clamp to make it really tight. Set a drill bit, a 1/16 or a little larger, long enough that it'll pass all the way through the cabinet side, and then drill right through that little poke mark that you made and into the cabinet bottom. Notice the cabinet bottom slid a little bit. I have to reset it. You know, I want it to be nice and accurate for each hole that I drill. Okay, the overall neatness of your cabinet depends heavily on getting this step right, so take your time. Get that joint lined up just so, and drill your pilot hole. And so on your way around the rest of the cabinet. You loosen that clamp and line up one joint at a time and tighten the clamp down again to hold the joint tight while you drill. 1, 2, 3, 4 corners. Okay, laying the 4 pieces down on the table again with the outside faces facing up. Still with the 1/16 bit, we're going to drill 4 holes in the cabinet bottom. Notice these are the outside 4 corners. There's 2 sets of holes, and we want the outer ones nearest the corners. Look at that template. See, you've got 2 different styles of hole. We're talking about the 1/16 hole in the very corner here. And these are blind holes, meaning they don't go all the way through. They're just holding a little screw to hold on the foot later. Now we're going to counter bore and countersink the holes that you drilled previously in the cabinet sides. Now, making reference to the cabinet bottom template again, the 4 inner holes, the ones furthest from the corner, these are the ones that you're going to counter bore and countersink. So you're using the 9/64 drill and a countersink bit. And these may be the same, or they may be two separate tools, depending on what you bought at the hardware store. Zip, 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 zip. If you're not real sure about counterboring, you may want to, or countersinking, you want to practice on the bottom because the depth of the countersink is not very critical on the bottom piece. Now we're going to do the side. We're going to re-drill the 8 holes that you drilled in the side. We're going to re-drill the 16th hole into a 9/64 hole and countersink it. You want to get that countersink just below the surface of the surrounding wood. Not too deep, not too shallow. You also notice I'm drilling into a backing piece of wood here. That will make the holes clean on the other side and also protects that table. So we're re-drilling these 8 holes, plus each side has a 5th hole. There it is, that little point there. This hole is going to hold the grill panel in place. We drill that out and countersink it. Try again, get it as uniform as possible. Here's the cabinet top. The top also has one of these holes with a counterbore and a countersink. That holds the top of the grill frame in place. So we haven't drilled this one yet. We're going to do this in one step with my 9/64 and a countersinking bit. Down it goes. Now we're changing to a 3/16 bit to drill out the handle holes. You can use any old handle. You can take a handle off your mother's stockings drawer if you think you can get away with it, if you like that look better. But it may have a different spacing and maybe a different hole size necessary for the screw that goes with it. So if you're using the stock handle that we supply, you use this 3/16 bit. Now if you have any blowout on the underside of the wood, scrape that off with a little piece of rough or medium grit sandpaper, say 120. Get those nice and smooth. Check all the pieces and take off all the blowout. It'll interfere with your glue later on. Set the 4 pieces back up again, lining up your corner marks, and apply a little bit of glue to one end of one of the tops, or the top. Do one end of the top. Spread it out nice and uniform. I like to use a screw tip. It's like using a trowel to spread adhesive under a tile floor or something, but you can just use your finger. I'm using a good quality wood glue. I like to use Titebond 3. Very strong, sets very fast. Now poke 2 screws into the holes of the matching side piece. Line up the tips of the screws with your 2 pilot holes. In the printed manual, I don't use a clamp at this point, and I regretted it. The results was a very sloppy box. So here I'm illustrating how to use a clamp again to line up that hole and hold it firm while you drive the screws home. So just putting the 4 pieces roughly back together, but this one corner with the screws, we're going to line this up nice and accurate, just like we did when we drilled it. And then tighten that clamp nice and tight to hold it firm while I set the screws. So I'm trying to thread those screws in to engage the pilot holes. I'm checking that the joint is nice and smooth, and then squeeze that clamp down nice and tight. I'm using a clamp with rubber pads, so you can squeeze tight and get away with it. Now I'm setting the drill to a very low clutch setting, like 1 or 2, because I don't want to overdrive these screws at this point. You could just use a hand screwdriver. I'm driving this just until the screw head sets inside the hole there and no tighter. It's not very tight. It's barely snug. I want to leave that joint just a little bit of ability to move later on. You'll see why. Now zip, 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 we're doing the other holes. Notice you got to add the bottom to the same side. And then when you're done, you'll add the other side to the top and bottom. If you do it differently, you will find out what bad situation you made for yourself. So now we've got the top and the bottom exposed. We're going to put glue on the second end of both the top and the bottom, and then add the side to it. Now I'm driving these screws through so that the tips stick out just a little bit so that you can drive them, you can line them up with the 4 pilot holes. You'll be able to feel them engaging the pilot holes. Depending on how straight the cabinet is, this may take a little bit of hinking to get all 4 of them to engage. All right, line up the lettering, the way the joints are lettered. Make sure I've got that right. Don't want to put it on upside down. That would be bad. Okay, it goes into the 2 holes there. And you see they don't quite want to line up yet, so I'm going to have to do one joint at a time. And again, back with the clamp. Line up one corner and hold the clamp gently snug. Line up the other corner. So I have all 4 screws worked into all 4 pilot holes. Line up one of the corners just perfectly. There it is. And then squeeze down that clamp. and drive the screws just barely snug. Not too tight yet. We'll tighten them up in a minute. Now, measure diagonally across the box, across both diagonals to the outer corner. Very carefully measure whether they're the same or not. If it measures longer across one diagonal, it means the box is not quite square. You could use a square. I didn't happen to have one with me today, so I like this measuring trick, even though it can be tricky to distinguish those little 16th marks. If it's longer in one direction, put the clamp on it and snug it down, and this will tend to squeeze the box into square. You can check once more, make sure it's closer to uniform in both directions. It's going to be kind of an average between the two numbers that you measured earlier. Now you can tighten all 8 screws. Zip, 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 zip. If the clamp is in the way, do all the screws that aren't blocked by the clamp and then take off the clamp. Now let it sit for a full 4 hours until that glue is really hard. And then if you have any uneven joints, like a couple of these in the back are a little uneven, use a 60 grit sandpaper to grind down that joint. Poplar sands very easily. I am using a terrific orbital sander here, and this becomes quick, fast, easy, high quality work. It works just as well with with a sandpaper sheet wrapped around a scrap of wood. That works too, it just takes a little longer. If the end grain is not quite smooth, you can grind that flat as well. Once the joints are all flat, this is the time to put on an edge detail if you want. We use a 3/16 roundover bit on the 4 front edges and the 4 sides. We leave the back edges square. The key to remember here is do not run the bearing into a screw hole. That's very bad. It's naughty. The bearing will drop into the screw hole and ruin the edge. Instead, you have to run it along this nice smooth front edge where there is no interfering screw hole. Got it? We're not going to talk much about how to use routers. That's a different subject. Go find a friend to teach you if you've never used a router before. They are dangerous. Don't use a router on this project if you've never handled one before. They're dangerous and tricky. So here I'm rounding over all the sides that I wish to, always making sure that the bearing is going along a smooth, straight surface and it's not going to drop into any of those screw holes. You could apply a couple of different shapes here. Not a lot of room to work with, but you can dramatically influence the overall style based on the finish you choose and the edge detail that you apply at this point. If you come up with something different, a different look, let's see it. Send us a picture. Okay, now we're going to sand the entire box with 120 grit sandpaper. We're going to sand over the edges here to clean up the router detail that you applied. If there are any burn marks, you want to take those out, but you also want to be careful that you don't obliterate the shape itself. So do this gently with a light touch. A power sander makes quick work of it. The inside edges where they're square, you do not use an orbital on that. You'll tear it to smithereens. But we do have to strike off the sharp square edge that the wood came with. So just do that with a piece of hand sandpaper. When you sanded the whole thing twice with 120 and 220 sandpaper, we're going to go ahead and stain it. We like to use a dark Minwax stain. It's dark walnut. You can use any stain you like. The key to staining is to get the whole thing really wet and then wipe the whole thing off. As long as the stain goes on there wet, then you're using enough. Now, Minwax stains are very forgiving. It can sit on there for 5 minutes or 15 minutes, and you'll get similar results when you're all done. Just make sure you use enough. Keep the surface wet. I'm blotting stain into the end grain, which soaks it up like nobody's business. Do the whole thing inside and out. Take a quick look around, make sure you didn't miss any spots like that one right there. When the whole thing is completely covered with stain, immediately take a cloth large enough to hold that stain and wipe it all off again. I once tried to do this with a very small rag and it became saturated, and then it does no good at removing stain. It just smears it around. There you go. When I get near the end, I try to be very careful about not leaving fingerprints. See, I'm holding it from the back, and I'm gently wiping the face and the sides to make sure there's no streaks and no fingerprints. I like to leave it on a couple of drinking straws or pencils or some scraps of wood from the wood shop. I said the back is resting on these little props, so there's virtually no contact between the cabinet and the drying surface. Leave it for 4 full hours to dry completely. Now we're going to polyurethane it. I like to use this other Minwax product. You can use whatever you like, but we like Minwax Poly Wipe-On. I'm using a nice clean rag. This can be a small rag. In fact, a small rag works better. I dip it into some of the poly in this little cup here. I've taped that cup down to the table so it doesn't slide around. Something I found out the hard way too. This is very forgiving polyurethane. Many polys, you got to be really careful about brush strokes and drips. We like this stuff because it smooths right out. I have a really hard time leaving a brush stroke or a drip. This is my favorite step of woodworking. The wood just really comes alive when you put its first top coat on it. Again, as you get towards the end, you got to be very careful about how you hold it so you don't leave fingerprints or smudges. I'm doing the front and sides last. You just inspect the whole thing for drips and smudges and fingerprints. And there it is. Let it sit for a full 4 hours, and look at that gorgeous thing. It should be a little fuzzy at this point, and we're going to put on a second coat. If it feels a little gritty, we're going to very gently sand this with a piece of 320 grit sandpaper. Do not use an orbital. Do this by hand. This will produce a fine white powder that feels as soft as velvet. That's how you know you let it dry thoroughly enough and that you've sanded it just right. So go ahead and gently sand the whole thing, just the outside. Leave the inside alone. It's done. It's perfectly adequate to leave the inside the way it is. Gently sand the whole thing. Don't go all the way through the poly and damage the stain below. Once you've sanded the whole thing, wipe that sanding dust off. It serves no useful purpose anymore. Other types of finishes, you leave the dust in place, but with polyurethanes, you should remove it. Now go ahead and add a second coat. Oh, is that gorgeous? Look at that. It's smooth as glass. It's looking like a piano. And again, because the inside, you're not going to put a second coat on the inside, so you can hold the cabinet from the inside when you're putting on your finish coat. That makes it much easier to handle, and you can manipulate the thing without ever touching the outside at all. And there it is with its finished coat. At this point, if you like the way it looks, it's done. You may put on a third coat if you want. I rarely do. Assuming that it's done, it's time to put on the hardware. So we're going to put the feet on the bottom with a little screwdriver, a little Phillips screwdriver. These go into the 4 outer corner holes on the cabinet bottom. Okay, you don't have to over tighten those or you'll just kind of warp the feet. Next, we're going to install the handle. The handle comes with its own screws. You need a short length screwdriver to get inside the box to install these. The first screw is always easy enough to install, and sometimes the second one's a little tricky to line up the second one. Worst case scenario, if they don't line up, you may have to re-drill one of the holes to make it a little larger. There it is. Tighten that nice and tight. It's a solid aluminum handle. It holds on nice and tight. And next we're going to make the grill cloth frame, a whole project of its own. Take these 4 little pieces of wood, line them up just the way you see here. Okay. Put a drop of glue on the ends of 2 long pieces. This is somewhat analogous to how we put together the cabinet. We're smearing some glue on the end grain there. Assemble the 4 by hand, just with your fingers. It's quite easy. When you like the way they line up, take the old bar clamp and park it right across here. The paper manual talks about leaving it just like this, and then it will usually wind up glued to your table. With this particular clamp, Brock likes to pick the whole thing up off the table and stand the clamp up on end like that so it can dry that way. That may or may not work with your clamp. Once the glue is thoroughly dry, go ahead and paint the thing. You're just painting the surface and the inside edges. The outside edges are optional. They wind up hidden. You can use a marker to do this too. Here's your grill cloth. Now we're going to lay the grill cloth face down on the table. Face down means the black lines are facing upwards and the silver lines are facing downwards. Place the frame centered on the cloth about 1 inch from the edge. Pick one of these black lines and fold 90 degrees along that particular black line. This is also very clearly described in the printed manual. And that's how we do it. You keep bending it till it stands up to 90 degrees. Put the guy back in there, center it along the length of the grill cloth, and identify a thread that lines up at the end of the frame, and then cut that fold up to the thread that you choose. So we're just more easily shown than described. You're simply slitting that corner right up to where you want the frame to be. and then fold along the thread that defines the location of the frame. Now we're going to do it for another side. Tuck it into the corner there. Snip, snip. And this is very clearly described in the manual, and this video just kind of shows you to give you a feel for how it's done, how it works for us. Snip, snip, 2 snips, fold. And voila, there it is. You get your 4 folds. They should fit snugly around the cloth. The cloth fits tight against the back. The frame fits tight against the back of the cloth. At this point, you better check how straight and square you made your lines. Get out a carpenter square or a speed square and check how straight these things look across the front of the frame. The stuff is pretty stretchy. If it will not come straight for you, you're going to have to pull and stretch the fabric a little bit to get it more straight. You like the way it looks? Tack it in place with 1 staple in the middle of each side. We like an electric stapler. So nice. You can use a regular manual, but oh boy. If you know anybody with an electric, go borrow it. It's nice. Still looks nice and straight. Then go ahead and staple back and forth, left to right, on either side of the center, all the way down the length of one side. If one of the staples doesn't seat properly, squeeze it into place with a channel lock pliers. It's got to be tight into the fabric or the finished frame will not fit well into the amplifier. Then you can snip these extra pieces off the corners. As you're going along, you should check for straightness and smoothness from time to time. If anything is starting to go cattywampus, pull out a staple or 2 and stretch the fabric this way and that and reset the staples. They come out pretty easily with the pliers. Okay, now it's just time to fold the fabric over to the back of the frame and staple it straight down. Again, start in the middle and then kind of go left and right towards the corners. Bang, 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 bang. Leave the staples away from the corners themselves because we're going to handle those a little differently. Again, if a staple doesn't seat entirely, squeeze it down with the pliers. Now in the corner, it's like wrapping a Christmas present. Tuck those 2 pieces, one under the other, nice and flat and smooth, and then cut diagonally across the 2 layers of fabric right into the corner with a razor blade or an X-Acto or utility knife. You'll cut off 2 little triangles, take them out, and I'll staple that miter joint flat to the frame. Pop. Nice, and you have a nice mitered corner. We're going to do similar to the other 3 corners. Flatten the tabs, slit diagonally, remove the triangles, staple it flat. And look at those nice 4 mitered corners. How neat is that? If there's an extra width of material along that side, you can cut it off and get it out of the way. You can cut off any other loose stray hairs. And then very carefully, because you can set this on fire if you're not careful, be very, very careful. If you're under the age of 12, I would get your parents to do this. Use a lighter to singe the corners of your grill cloth. This will kind of seal them up. There's a fine line between sealing the loose edges and melting and ruining your grill cloth, so be super careful. But boy, does that look nice when you've done it right. Isn't that slick? Now we're going to use a heat gun to tighten up this cloth. The cloth will shrink a little bit with heat. It will also curl up and melt and burn with heat, all right? So be super careful here. And by very gently and uniformly warming the cloth, you can actually get it to wind up nice and flat. Look at that beautiful grill cloth frame. It's all ready to go. Time to assemble your cabinet and we'll be done. Isn't this great? Okay, the amplifier goes into the cabinet. I like to slide it in from the back. The printed material shows it going in from the front. It should fit pretty nicely. Should slip right in there. Now, holding it firmly in place so it doesn't flop around, stand the cabinet on end and put one of the 1-inch sheet metal screws through this hole in the bottom. Now, if you piloted those holes accurately, they will line up perfectly with the laser cut holes inside the bottom of the chassis, and that will slip right into place. Do not use a screw gun for this step because you don't want to over drill these things. Put the 4 screws in, just get them started, and then go back round round and round like you would lug nuts on a tire, and tighten them down. Don't over tighten, or you could strip out the chassis. Look at that! Isn't that sharp? Last step is to install the grill frame. Let's see how well that fits. Sometimes it's perfect, sometimes it's a little snug, sometimes a little loose. That is gorgeous. Now use a piloting bit just to get a little pilot hole started in the sides of the grill frame. Notice we're using the 16th bit here, or slightly larger than 16th. You're going through the grill cloth, and just to get a little hole started in the frame, because you don't want it to split when you run a screw through it. Using a screwdriver, run a screw through the top of the frame first. This is when your last wood screws. That can go in snug. And now you're running one from the side and from the other side. Don't over tighten the side screws because you could pull the frame apart, which is not the objective. You're just holding it in place. So you may seat the top one a little tighter than the side ones. Look at that, that's it. You've got a new Percolator guitar amp.